long rambling answer to your question is that a few years ago, my family was hit by a drunk driver. And all of these memories from my childhood, all of these things that I had thought I had healed from because I was doing so well in my life and I convinced myself that nothing mattered, they weren't, I wasn't able to push them aside anymore.
Mm,
They came up in every interaction, they came up in every thought, in every fiber of my being.
mm,
So I really had to go back and look at the things that I had experienced in my childhood. So I was sexually abused and I
mm,
had never talked about it to anyone. I had never
mm,
expressed anything to anyone. I just made a decision to prove my abuser wrong. And I was going to show him how awesome I could be and look at how everybody was going to love me and
mm,
look at how amazing I would become. And so for me, I brought up the undoing. It was after that car crash I had I pretty much started unraveling, and when you look at the trajectory of my life, that car crash is not the worst thing that has ever happened to me. But that's what I think is so important about all of this is we can never look at somebody else's life
mm,
and think like, oh, that's the thing that should have broke them, or oh, they're overreacting over
mm,
here. Because you don't know what's all stacked up to get to
mm,
that point, right?
mm,
So at that point, I really went into just okay, yep, this is still there and I need to see how it's showing up.
mm,
And so I did a lot of journaling. I did a lot of different forms of trauma therapy and healing modalities. And during that time, I also journaled. And when I kind of was through this major process of working through a lot of the things that were continually coming up, I went back and I read my journals. And because I'm kind of a research geek, professor, researcher at heart, I I started to notice themes in my journals.
mm,
And so I coded them just like I would code data if I was, doing a research project. I had my highlighters of different
mm,
colors and everything like that. And I just kept seeing different themes.
mm,
And I was like, oh, okay, this is what's happening here.
mm,
These are the ways that I am still having these coping mechanisms that I had when I was a child, but I don't need anymore. These are the ways I'm still people pleasing as an adult because I'm so afraid of what somebody's reaction toward me is going to be.
mm,
Just kind of all these realizations. And I knew then at that point too that I wasn't the only person who felt these things. And so those themes became the chapters in my book. And I wrote
mm,
a book about just some of the experiences that I had throughout that process and some of the realizations I had about myself and then how I interact with other people. And I really never intended to do that. And I think that that's what's also important, to talk about when people are going through some of these things is we try to control things so much
mm,
sometimes, and to put things into a container or on a trajectory or on a path that we think is going to work out. And so it was really, where I am now and what I'm doing with it is never anything that I expected, but it's also brought me to a place now where I can show up. That's why authenticity, it's like, yeah, remembering who I was,
mm,
remembering who I am, and remembering, how to show up as that person every day
mm.
instead of just being able to show up in these small spaces,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah. Well, I'll tell you what I find fascinating about that story and the work you do is so you're talking about like, this idea that you were like, you kind of just tried to suppress it or ignore it, the trauma, and like I'll be fine and I'll kind of work through it. And I think there's so many people listening that whether they had trauma as you had or different forms, but whatever it might be, where that resonates so deeply and so deeply at a level where like I think a lot of people still believe that. Like I can just kind of tuck it away and it'll be fine, even though we kind of know you can't. And then, even the things you're saying about how you started to heal, journaling and really digging into it and starting to look at it and accepting the idea that I can't just push this away. It's showing through in some way. It's fascinating to me because all of those words are accurate and right as far as I can tell. But for some reason, it is so hard for them to actually sink in for people and understand. And I'm not judging them in any way. I know why it's so hard, but it's just such an interesting thing of how we function because I've never had trauma in that form, but I can even relate to it as you're saying it of things that have happened to me where I've said like, well, I got it. I can handle this. And I
Mhm.
really believe it. I really, really do in that moment. And I think it's why the approach you've taken is so interesting to me, that journaling and then that coding and going back and looking at the patterns. I kind of I believe in that as well. The way I've kind of tried to work through my own personal journey is very like logical and analytical. And that doesn't work for everybody, and maybe there's pros and cons to that, but the way I've kind of find dealing with our own minds and all the flaws and the identity issues and the ego and the biases and the trauma is that you almost have to be very logical to look at it because there's so much going on there. And I think it's for our own best, well intentions. Our mind tries to protect us and keep us away from things. And I almost think of it like you're playing chess and you have to, like, in some ways outsmart it to get to the root issues and work through it because it's painful and because it's trying to protect us. So I think that approach you take, I think, is a way to overcome that, right? That natural inclination to be like, I'm fine, is like, well, let's just look at this very objectively and analytically and kind of work through it and see what's really there. It sounds like that's kind of what's worked for you. Is that kind of fair?